Chapter 1. Paris, before Paris. The birth of a settlement long before Paris became the city of lights, romance, and revolutions. It was something far more fragile, a small settlement fighting for survival. No grand palaces, no wide boulevards, no monuments meant to last forever. Just a river, an island, and a people who chose the perfect place to begin a story that would change Europe. Thousands of years ago, the land around the Seine River was wild and unpredictable. Dense forests covered the countryside, and the river itself was both a blessing and a threat. It flooded without warning, but it also brought life, fish, fertile soil, and natural protection. For early humans, this balance of danger and opportunity made the region irresistible. By around the 3rd century BCE, a Celtic tribe known as the Parisii settled near the river. And they were not kings or emperors. They were traders, fishermen, and craftsmen. But what made them powerful was not their weapons. It was their location. At the heart of their settlement lay a small island in the Seine. This island was easy to defend, surrounded by flowing water on all sides, and perfectly positioned for trade. Boats carrying goods from northern Europe to the Mediterranean naturally passed through this point. Whoever controlled this crossing controlled commerce. The Parisii understood this instinctively. They built wooden houses on raised ground to survive floods. They created simple docks for boats. Markets formed where traders exchanged salt, grain, metals, and handmade goods. Over time, this island became a living hub, small but active. Quiet but important. This place would later be known as Île de la Cité, but at the time, it was simply home. Life here was harsh. Winters were cold, summers unpredictable. Floods could destroy homes overnight. Disease spread easily. There were no stone walls, no permanent defenses. Yet the Parisii stayed. Generation after generation, they rebuilt, adapted, and grew stronger. Their society was tribal, but organized. Elders guided decisions. Religious rituals honored nature spirits, and gods believed to control the river and the land. The Seine was sacred, not just a source of survival, but a living force that shaped their destiny. What the Parisii did not know was that their peaceful river settlement sat on the edge of a coming storm. As centuries passed, word of this strategic crossing spread. Merchants talked, explorers mapped routes, and eventually, soldiers noticed. From the south came Rome. The Roman Republic was expanding rapidly, swallowing territories and reshaping the ancient world. When Roman forces pushed into Gaul, they didn't just see tribes, they saw opportunity. The settlement of the Parisii stood directly in their path. But even before Roman conquest, Paris had already proven something critical. Location creates destiny. Unlike many ancient towns that vanished into history, this settlement endured because it sat at the crossroads of trade, travel, and survival. The river connected it to the wider world. The island protected it. The people adapted. This was not an accident. It was the foundation of everything Paris would become. By the time Roman legions approached, they did not find a primitive village. They found a functioning settlement with economic value, regional influence, and control over river traffic. And that made it worth conquering and worth transforming. In many ways, the true birth of Paris did not happen with stone buildings or royal crowns. It happened the moment the Parisii chose that island, that river, that crossing. Every empire that followed, Roman, medieval, revolutionary, modern, built upon this original decision. Paris was not born from power. It was born from position, and that position would soon pull the city into the heart of one of the greatest empires the world had ever known. But Rome would not simply occupy Paris. It would remake it, and in doing so, turn a river settlement into a city. In the next chapter, we'll see how Paris transformed under Roman rule. and how Lutetia rose from wood and mud into stone and order. On Chapter 2, Roman Lutetia. When Paris became a city, when the Roman legions finally arrived at the settlement of the Parisii, they did not come as explorers, they came as conquerors. Rome did not negotiate with geography. It absorbed it, and the small river settlement on the Seine was about to be pulled into the machinery of one of history's greatest empires. In 52 BCE, Roman forces under Julius Caesar pushed deeper into Gaul. Tribal resistance was fierce but fragmented. The Parisii, like many others, fought to defend their land, but Rome's discipline, engineering, and sheer scale were unstoppable. When the fighting ended, the settlement survived, not because Rome spared it, but because Rome needed it. The Romans renamed the area Lutetia, a name possibly linked to the muddy riverbanks that surrounded the town. But despite the humble name, Rome had grand plans. Rome did not rule by chaos, it ruled by order. Almost immediately, the landscape began to change. Wooden structures were replaced with stone. Dirt paths were transformed into straight, paved roads aligned with Roman precision. These roads did not just serve Lutetia, they connected it to the entire Roman world. Suddenly, Paris was no longer isolated. It was plugged into an empire stretching from Britain to North Africa. The center of life slowly shifted away from the island. While the Ile de la Cité remained important, Roman planners expanded onto the left bank of the Seine. There, they laid out the city according to Roman design: forums, baths, temples, and theaters. For the first time, Lutetia looked like a city. And at the heart of Roman life stood the Forum, a public square where politics, trade, and social life collided. Merchants sold goods from distant lands, officials announced laws, citizens gathered not just to survive, but to belong to something larger. Nearby rose public bathhouses, symbols of Roman civilization. These were not luxuries for the elite alone. Baths were places of hygiene, relaxation, and conversation. Warm water flowed through engineered systems beneath the floors, a level of technology unseen in Gaul before Rome arrived. The message was clear. Rome was here to stay. Religion also transformed. Roman gods stood beside local deities. Temples rose, blending Roman architecture with Gallic traditions. This fusion created a new identity, neither fully Roman nor fully tribal. Lutetia became a hybrid city, shaped by empire but grounded in local roots. The population grew steadily. Soldiers retired and settled here. Traders arrived, knowing Roman protection meant stability. Artisans flourished under new demand. Lutetia was no longer just surviving, it was prospering. But Roman rule was not gentle. Taxes were heavy. Authority was absolute. Resistance was crushed swiftly. The peace Rome brought came at the cost of independence. Yet over time, many locals adapted. Roman citizenship offered advantages. Latin replaced native languages in administration. Roman law replaced tribal customs. Slowly, the people of Lutetia began to think of themselves not just as Parisians, but as Romans. By the 2nd century CE, Lutetia had become a thriving provincial city. Its amphitheater echoed with performances and spectacles. Its streets bustled with life, and its position on the Seine made it a key commercial hub in northern Gaul. Yet despite all this growth, Lutetia remained modest compared to Rome itself. It was important, but not dominant. And perhaps that was its strength. It avoided the political chaos of imperial capitals while enjoying the benefits of empire. But empires do not last forever. By the late 3rd century, cracks began to appear. Rome's borders were under pressure. Invasions increased, resources stretched thin. And as instability spread, Lutetia felt the tremors. Defenses were strengthened. Walls were built. Life became more cautious. The city retreated inward, once again relying on the natural protection of the river island. History was repeating itself, but now with Roman stone instead of Celtic wood. When Roman authority finally weakened, Lutetia did not collapse, and it endured. That endurance would prove crucial. Rome had given the city roads, architecture, law, and identity. Even as Roman power faded, its legacy remained embedded in the streets, the stones, and the mindset of the people. Lutetia was no longer a tribal settlement. It was a Roman city, and when Rome finally fell, the city did not fall with it. Instead, it stood ready for a new chapter, one shaped not by emperors, but by kings, churches, and belief. The Roman city would fade, but Paris would rise. In the next chapter, we enter the medieval world, where faith, monarchy, and power collide to reshape Paris once again. Chapter 3. Kings, churches, and the medieval power struggle. When Roman authority finally faded from Gaul, it left behind more than broken roads and empty forums. It left a vacuum. And into that vacuum stepped two forces that would define medieval Paris for centuries: the crown and the cross. As imperial power collapsed in the 5th century, Lutetia shed its Roman name and slowly became Paris. The city shrank, withdrew, and hardened itself against uncertainty. Trade declined. Stone buildings fell into ruin, but Paris did not disappear. Instead, it adapted, once again. This time, survival depended not on emperors, but on faith. Christianity spread rapidly through the region, offering structure in a world that had lost order. Churches replaced temples. Bishops replaced Roman administrators. And Paris, sitting safely along the Seine, became a spiritual anchor in a chaotic land. The city's importance rose dramatically when the Frankish kings took notice. In the late 5th century, King Clovis chose Paris as one of his primary residences. That single decision changed everything. Paris was no longer just a regional town. It became a royal city. Power returned to its streets, but now it wore a crown instead of a laurel wreath. Kings needed legitimacy. The church provided it. Monasteries and churches multiplied across the city. Religious leaders gained immense influence, sometimes rivaling the authority of the king himself. Paris became a place where politics and belief were inseparable. At the heart of this transformation rose one of the most powerful symbols in European history: Notre Dame. Construction began in the 12th century, and it took generations to complete. But Notre Dame was more than a cathedral. It was a declaration. Its massive stone walls, towering spires, and stained glass windows told the world that Paris was chosen by God and by power. Around it, the city expanded rapidly. Narrow streets twisted through crowded neighborhoods. Markets overflowed with goods. Scholars, priests, merchants, and craftsmen poured in. Paris was becoming one of the largest cities in Europe, and with growth came conflict. The medieval world was not peaceful. Kings fought nobles, nobles fought each other, the church fought everyone, and sometimes itself. Paris sat at the center of these struggles, a prize worth controlling. French kings gradually strengthened their grip, transforming Paris into the permanent capital of the kingdom. Fortified walls rose. Palaces expanded. Authority became centralized. But the city was far from stable. Famine struck without warning. Plagues swept through overcrowded streets, and fires consumed entire districts. And yet Paris endured, stubborn, resilient, and restless. One of the city's greatest strengths emerged during this period: knowledge. By the 12th century, Paris had become the intellectual heart of Europe. The University of Paris attracted students from across the continent. Theology, philosophy, and law were debated fiercely in lecture halls and taverns alike. Ideas became weapons. Some challenged royal authority, others questioned church doctrine. Paris was no longer just ruled by power, it was shaped by thought. But ideas can be dangerous. Tensions between the crown, the church, and the people erupted repeatedly. Riots broke out. Revolts were crushed. Kings tightened control, while priests warned of divine punishment. Then came war. So the 100 Years' War turned Paris into a battleground of loyalty and fear. English forces occupied the city. French kings were driven away. Betrayal and desperation filled the streets. Paris suffered, but it learned. When French control was finally restored, the city emerged hardened, politically aware, and deeply scarred. Power had shifted permanently. Kings ruled more absolutely. The church remained influential, but cracks were beginning to show. Medieval Paris had been forged through struggle, between faith and authority, tradition and change, survival and ambition. By the late Middle Ages, Paris was no longer a Roman relic or a fragile settlement. It was a capital with a dangerous combination: population, power, and ideas. That combination would soon ignite something far greater than war. It would ignite revolution. And in the next chapter, Paris explodes as centuries of tension erupt into blood, fire, and the fall of kings. Chapter 4: Revolution, Blood, and the Fall of Monarchy. By the late 18th century, Paris was a city sitting on a powder keg. For centuries, kings had ruled from palaces while ordinary people struggled in the streets. Bread was expensive. Taxes were crushing. Wealth was concentrated in the hands of nobles and clergy, while the poor starved just outside gilded gates. Paris was angry. Ideas had been building for decades. Enlightenment thinkers questioned divine rule and absolute monarchy. Writers spoke of liberty, equality, and the rights of man. These ideas spread through cafes, salons, and crowded neighborhoods. Paris did not just consume ideas. It amplified them. When France's financial system collapsed under debt and mismanagement, and the tension snapped. In 1789, the people of Paris rose. The moment that changed everything came on July 14th, when a furious crowd stormed the Bastille. The fortress prison was not just a building, it was a symbol of royal tyranny. Its fall sent shockwaves through Europe. The message was clear: the people were no longer afraid. Paris transformed overnight. Crowds filled the streets, revolutionary banners replaced royal symbols. Political clubs formed, each more radical than the last. Power no longer flowed only from the palace, it surged from the masses. But revolution is never clean. Fear ruled the city as much as hope. Suspected enemies of the revolution were hunted down. Neighbors turned on neighbors. Justice became swift, public, and brutal. At the center of it all stood the guillotine. Public executions became a grim spectacle. Kings, queens, nobles, priests, all were dragged to the blade. When Louis XVI was executed, it marked the absolute end of monarchy's divine authority. When Marie Antoinette followed, no illusion of mercy remained. Paris had crossed a line. The revolution devoured its own leaders. Factions fought bitterly. Radical voices demanded more blood, more purity, more control. The city entered the reign of terror, where survival depended on loyalty or silence. Yet even in chaos, Paris was remaking the world. Old laws were erased, new rights were declared. The concept of citizenship replaced loyalty to a king. Paris became the laboratory of modern politics, testing ideas that would echo far beyond France. Eventually, exhaustion set in. The terror collapsed under its own weight. Out of the ruins rose a new kind of ruler. Not a king by birth, but a general by ambition. Napoleon Bonaparte. Napoleon brought order where chaos had ruled. He crowned himself emperor, blending revolutionary ideals with authoritarian control. Paris once again became the center of power, now commanding armies instead of mobs. Under Napoleon, Paris expanded and modernized. But war followed him everywhere. Europe burned. And when his empire finally collapsed, Paris paid the price. Foreign armies occupied the city. Pride turned to humiliation. Once again, Paris stood at a crossroads. The 19th century did not bring peace. It brought transformation. Kings returned, then fell again. Revolutions erupted in 1830 and 1848. Barricades rose in the streets. Blood soaked the cobblestones. Paris became synonymous with uprising. Yet from this violence emerged the modern city. Medieval streets were torn down. Their wide boulevards replaced narrow alleys, not just for beauty, but for control. The city was redesigned to prevent barricades, to allow armies to move quickly, to dominate crowds. Paris was being reshaped physically and psychologically. By the end of the century, Paris had become a paradox. A city of beauty built on rebellion, order enforced after chaos, freedom born from blood. It was no longer just France's capital, it was a symbol, a warning to kings, an inspiration to revolutionaries, a reminder that power, once challenged, can never fully return to its old form. But the trials of Paris were far from over. The 20th century would test the city in ways revolution never could. Through total war, occupation, and survival against forces far greater than itself. In the next chapter, and Paris faces its darkest hours. As empires clash and the city fights to endure. Chapter 5. Napoleon to World Wars. Paris under fire. As the smoke of revolution faded, Paris found itself standing at the center of a new and dangerous age. The city had overthrown kings, crowned an emperor, and rewritten the meaning of power. But history was not finished testing Paris. In fact, its greatest trials were still to come. The fall of Napoleon in 1815 left Paris shaken. Foreign armies marched through its streets, symbols of defeat where victory once ruled. The empire had collapsed, and with it, the illusion that military glory could protect the city forever. Paris was forced to confront a painful truth. Ideas alone could not stop armies. The 19th century brought uneasy rebuilding. Industry expanded, railways connected Paris to the rest of France. The factories rose alongside cafes and theaters. The city grew louder, denser, and more restless. Beneath the elegance, tension simmered. Then, in 1870, war returned. The Franco-Prussian War struck fast and brutally. Paris was besieged, surrounded, and starved into submission. Food ran out. People ate horses, pets, even zoo animals. Hunger stripped the city of its glamour, revealing raw desperation beneath the surface. When defeat came, it sparked something even more dangerous than invasion. The Paris Commune of 1871 was a radical experiment. Workers and citizens briefly seized control of the city, rejecting traditional authority. For weeks, Paris was ruled by revolutionaries who dreamed of equality and justice. But the dream ended in blood. Government forces crushed the Commune mercilessly. Thousands were killed. Streets ran red once more, and Paris learned a bitter lesson. Rebellion inspired hope, but it also invited annihilation. Yet the city endured. By the late 19th century, Paris entered a golden age. Art, literature, and innovation flourished. Painters, writers, and thinkers transformed Paris into the cultural capital of the world. The city dazzled, but the peace was fragile. In 1914, Europe descended into catastrophe. World War I turned Paris into a city under threat. Though the front line stopped short, the danger was real. German artillery shelled the outskirts. Air raids struck fear into civilians. Every train station became a lifeline. Every street carried uncertainty. Paris survived, but at enormous cost. When the war ended, victory brought relief, but not stability. Millions were dead, Europe was exhausted, and Paris, once again, stood wounded but unbroken. But that fragile peace shattered in 1940. World War II arrived faster, darker, and more terrifying than anything before. German forces swept through France, and Paris fell without a prolonged battle. The city was occupied. For 4 long years, Paris lived under enemy control. Nazi flags flew where royal banners once stood. Soldiers marched through boulevards built for beauty, or not submission. Fear ruled daily life. Food was rationed. Freedom disappeared. Silence became survival, but Paris did not surrender its soul. Beneath the occupation, resistance grew. Secret networks formed. Messages were passed quietly. Sabotage spread through railways and communication lines. Ordinary citizens became silent warriors. Paris waited. In August 1944, liberation finally came. Allied forces approached, resistance fighters rose, and barricades returned. But this time, they stood for survival, not ideology. When German forces withdrew, the city erupted in celebration. Paris was free. The images traveled the world, crowds cheering, flags waving, joy flooding streets that had known only fear. Paris had survived occupation without losing its identity, but the scars remained. Post-war Paris faced a new challenge, rebuilding a world shattered by total war. Old empires were gone. New global powers emerged. Paris was no longer the political center of the world, but it remained something just as powerful. It became a symbol of endurance. The city had been invaded, starved, occupied, and bombed. Yet it refused to vanish. Every generation had faced destruction and rebuilt anyway. Paris entered the modern age carrying the weight of its past. A monument stood not just as beauty, but as memory. Streets remembered footsteps of soldiers and revolutionaries alike. What emerged was a city defined not by perfection, but by survival. Paris had learned how to fall and how to rise. And now, as the world looked forward, Paris prepared to transform once more. Not through war or empire, but through culture, identity, and global influence. The story was nearing its final chapter. In the next chapter, we see how Paris rose from war's shadow to become a modern global icon, a city remembered, admired, and endlessly reborn. Chapter 6. Modern Paris, from ruins to a global icon. When the guns finally fell silent after World War II, Paris stood exhausted but alive. Many European cities lay in ruins, their identities shattered beyond recognition. Paris, however, had emerged damaged yet intact, physically scarred, emotionally burdened, but unmistakably itself. The challenge now was not survival, it was reinvention. The post-war years transformed Paris into a city balancing memory and momentum. France rebuilt its economy, and Paris reclaimed its role as the nation's cultural heart. Cafes once again filled with voices. Artists returned. Writers, filmmakers, and philosophers shaped new movements that questioned authority, identity, and modern life. Paris became a city of ideas again, but this time on a global stage. The 1950s and 60s brought change at a pace never seen before. Immigration reshaped neighborhoods, old social structures weakened. A younger generation challenged tradition, hierarchy, and control. These tensions exploded in 1968 when students and workers flooded the streets, paralyzing the city. Barricades returned. But this time, the fight was not for kings or empires. It was for voice. Though the protests faded, their impact remained. Paris emerged more open, more contested, more modern. The city no longer belonged solely to rulers or elites. It belonged to its people, diverse, divided, and alive. As the decades passed, Paris refined its global image. Fashion houses turned the city into a trendsetter for the world. Cinema romanticized its streets. Tourists arrived in millions, drawn by history, beauty, and myth. Paris became an idea as much as a place. Yet beneath the glamour, challenges persisted. Economic inequality widened. Suburbs grew restless. Terrorist attacks shook the city, reminding the world that history's violence had not disappeared. It had simply changed shape. Still, Paris endured. And each crisis tested the city's identity. Each tragedy was followed by defiance. Candles in the streets, voices raised, life continuing. The same resilience that carried Paris through invasions, revolutions, and occupation carried it forward into the 21st century. The skyline evolved cautiously. Unlike cities that erased their past to build upward, Paris guarded its history. New structures rose, but the soul of the city remained anchored in stone, river, and memory. The Seine still flowed, just as it had for the Parisiens, the Romans, the kings, the revolutionaries. That river connected every version of Paris that ever existed. Modern Paris is not perfect. It is crowded, complex, and sometimes conflicted. But it is precisely this layered history that gives the city its unmatched depth. Every street holds multiple lives, and every building carries echoes of centuries. Paris is not defined by a single moment. It is defined by continuity. From tribal settlement to Roman city, from medieval capital to revolutionary furnace, from occupied streets to liberated celebration, from war-scarred survivor to global icon. Paris has been conquered, but never erased. It has been broken, but never silenced. That is why Paris matters, not because it is beautiful, not because it is famous, but because it proves that cities, like people, can suffer and still become symbols of hope. In the end, Paris is not just a place on a map. It is a reminder that history is not something we escape. It is something we carry forward, and as long as the Seine continues to flow, the story of Paris will never truly end. If you enjoyed the complete history of Paris, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications for more epic history stories.